Hey guys, welcome back to day 3. This will be your first official lecture distance-wise. So we're going to be looking at an introduction to homeostasis and laying some of the groundwork for the rest of Unit 4. We're also going to pull in a lot of previous units because this does a really nice job of kind of tying that all together. So, if I'm going back in time, you'll understand why. Just a heads up about how the whole play posit thing will work. What I'll be doing throughout the lecture is kind of giving you information and then going to either a blank screen or a new screen, and you won't have an opportunity to necessarily see on the screen what the answer is. And then I'll be asking you questions either about something that I would expect that you already know or something that was just said in the video. So feel free to take the play posit as many times as you want, but hopefully you'll be able to go through on the first first pass through of it. So without further ado, in terms of what you should be able to walk away by the end of this lesson, our goals are going to be to describe why cells have to maintain homeostasis and why living organisms do, what body systems the multicellular organisms specifically animals will be using to maintain homeostasis, and then talking about negative feedback. We will see negative feedback coming in a lot later in the unit with specific examples. So we already spent time at the beginning of the semester, I know it feels like eons ago, talking about the 8 characteristics of living things, and one of them is the ability to maintain homeostasis. What that really means is keeping either a stable internal environment or an environment that is drastically different than the area around it, right? So what's going on inside the cytoplasm is much different than the environment. For example, we can take a look at a nerve cell. And neurons work because of the fact that they have these huge differences between the inside and the outside of sodium, calcium, and potassium. So you can see on the inside here, we've got a really high concentration of potassium that's really low on the outside. And it doesn't necessarily have to stay at this exact amount, that 140 millimoles. Instead, it just needs to be relatively way higher than what's in the environment around it. But of course, maintaining a homeostasis can also mean keeping a really stable internal environment. And the example of that would be things like mammals being able to keep their body temperature within a very, very fine range. So as we go throughout the rest of the unit, you'll look at a lot of other examples of what kind of conditions humans very particularly will be keeping stable. So like I said, we're going to tie in some of the previous units and just make sure you're remembering some of the stuff from earlier. I'll come back later and ask you this question, which are what are the 8 characteristics of living things? So let's take a second and see if you remember them. Let's see if this will work for me. Okay. So we know that all living things had DNA as their genetic material. Our next unit is going to be on DNA and what that looks like, so I'm really excited about it. We know that living things are made out of cells. Remember that all cells are going to have the cell membrane, the DNA on the inside, the ribosomes, which are responsible for making the proteins, and the cytoplasm is just all the stuff inside. We also know that living things maintain homeostasis, so each of the cells and in a multicellular organism, the inside conditions are much different than their surroundings. To be able to do that, they have to be able to respond to stimulus or a stimuli. So one example of a stimuli is a drop in temperature. So it's any changes to the environment that the body can then respond to. And we'll be talking a lot about that in this unit as well, because it's pretty relevant to maintaining homeostasis. The use of matter and energy, so all living things have to have a metabolism. We talked about that in the last unit, and we'll see cell respiration is going to play a big part in one of the several of the different factors that need to be maintained relatively stably. That didn't make a ton of sense, but it will later. Living things grow and develop because of their use of matter and energy. So if they have enough matter, enough energy, they can use it to be bigger. ooh, magic. If they can grow and develop enough, then they can eventually get to the point that they're reproducing, and finally, as a group, all living things evolve. And I'm really bummed because it's looking like that'll be the one unit that we don't get to nearly as well as I had hoped. But moving on. Also, to kind of recap, so we're going to compare homeostasis in unicellular and multicellular organisms. So it's going to be really important to make sure that we recall what is unicellular, what is multicellular. And hey, while we're at it, let's go ahead and take a look at that prokaryotic, eukaryotic descriptions that we probably haven't thought about for quite some time, right? So when we're thinking unicellular, we're thinking one individual cell, right? And that's the entire organism. If it splits apart, now you have two organisms. Multicellular organisms are those that all of the cells are working together to help the whole cluster of cells be able to survive, to be able to get the nutrients that they need, and so forth. And so those are our multicellular organisms. And the way multicellular organisms are able to maintain homeostasis has to be a lot more complex. Also, while we're at it, a quick reminder about prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. No. So prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, whereas the eukaryotic do. So with all of that in mind, let's see if we can go ahead and remember what our examples are of unicellular prokaryote and eukaryotes. So for our unicellular prokaryotes, that's a pretty easy one. That is going to be our bacteria. The one that almost everybody forgets are going to be the eukaryotic unicellular. So they're the weird little guys that are kind of animal-like or kind of plant-like, but they're only one cell. And those guys collectively are going to be called protists. Delete, right? So algae, paramecium, amoeba, all of those interesting little things that you probably heard in 7th grade, but never really talked about what they were. In terms of prokaryotic cells that cluster together to make a multicellular organism, trick question. There are none. And then the eukaryotes are all the things that you're the most familiar with, your plants, animals, fungi, and we'll be dealing mainly today with animals, actually mainly in this unit. So to kind of recap this, the most important thing to understand is that every single cell, whether it's in a unicellular or multicellular organism, all cells have to be able to maintain homeostasis. So in a unicellular organism, they are in direct contact with the environment. So that one single cell is able to exchange materials, get the nutrients that it needs, get rid of wastes. But if you're a multicellular organism, you're really packed in there. And so any wastes that are maybe produced by one can't just dissolve out into the environment. Instead, it needs to be somehow managed in a way that allows the cell that is surrounded by other cells to still get the nutrients it needs, get rid of the wastes that it doesn't need. In other words, interact with the environment much more indirectly. Another little bit of a recap. Remember our blue book, which I'm really bummed that we're not going to spend a lot of time on. It's okay, not going to cry. Anyway, so the levels of organization, we spent the first half of the semester, or the third marking period, going through this first piece. And so just to kind of recap on what the upper levels of organization are, we know that cells are going to work together in groups called tissues. We'll finally start to get to look at now some of the different organs. So organs are a whole bunch of tissues that do something related to help the organism survive. And different organs all work together to perform a similar function that makes up the organ system to finally make up the organism. We will spend the time really looking at animals in particular, but please keep in mind that plants and that fungi are also going to have their own organs and organ systems, which is kind of weird to think of like a fungal organ system. Anyway, to just kind of remind you, you don't need to memorize these, but you've definitely seen the different human organ systems before. Things like the nervous system and the cardiovascular system, the digestive, the muscular, skeletal, the respiratory, and then this is the skin or the integumentary systems. Those are ones that you've seen before, but we're going to focus just on 6 of them, okay? So now would be a good time to recap what your different levels of organization are. So we know that these are the organ systems, but what are organ systems made out of? What are those things made out of? Okay, so to recap, cells are going to come together to form the tissues, tissues come together to form the organs, and then finally all of the different organs that are in that kind of work collectively make up your organ system. Okay, so I know that we never really got to finalize the test on the last unit, but I want to take a quick second to recap cell respiration, because as it turns out, there's a lot about taking sugar, breaking it down in order to make ATP that leaves your body needing to do homeostasis, right? To be able to make ATP, you need sugar. That means you need a constant influx of these sugars, right? You need to constantly have nutrients coming in. Every time you break down the sugar, you're going to be forming carbon dioxide molecules here. CO2, right? So we've got our glucose. That's getting down, broken down to form CO2. Well, that's a waste product. That's something that the body is going to need to find a way to get rid of. The energy from glucose is mostly transported into the electron carriers, which then have to have oxygen in order to be able to make the ATP in the final step here. So this oxygen here, we constantly need to be bringing it into the body. And then finally, we're making water, which 70-ish% of the body is made out of water. So that doesn't so much play a role in like we have to maintain the right amount of water, but cell respiration doesn't necessarily play a huge factor in that. Okay, so in this unit, those are all going to be things that we talk about. How your body maintains the right amount of glucose, and you can have too much glucose, and we'll look at exactly what that condition is. How the body maintains the right amount of carbon dioxide, because despite the fact that it's a waste product, you do need some in the body. How you make sure to have enough oxygen, and then we'll talk about how the body regulates water. But again, cell respiration doesn't play a huge factor in that side of it. So I'm going to draw like a very basic diagram to represent a multicellular organism. All right, here it is. Boom. I told you, basic, right? And yeah, I did not spend the last couple of weeks at home working on my drawing skills. Don't judge me too harsh. So we're going to look at systems that are specifically designed to either bring in or get rid of, or both, of different materials, right? So going back to the analogy that I started off at the beginning of this unit, what was that, the Friday before this whole thing started? If this is a town, we need a way to bring new stuff in. We need a way to get rid of wastes. And in terms of our bodies, we're also going to be having some systems that are two-way. But it's not just about getting it into the body. It needs to be circulated to every single cell in the body, right? Because if you are a cell right here, well, that's a long way from whatever this is. So how do you get your waste material over there to then be expelled into the environment? So when we look at this, at the body systems that you'll need to know, there's 6 of them. There's going to be 3 of them that are all about moving stuff either into, out, or both. There's going to be one that's all about moving that around and getting it to all of the different parts of the body. And then there is going to be 2 of them responsible for controlling that whole system. So let's kind of quickly take a look at this. This is kind of your overview, and then from there we can go more into depth. So exchanging materials with the environment, We essentially have three different systems for that. We have the system that is bringing in food and nutrients. And so with that, you particularly want to be thinking about glucose coming in the food that we eat and getting digested down because of glucose's importance in being able to provide the energy that the cells need. And when it comes to cell respiration, it's not just about glucose, but you need something else really important to be able to make ATP. And so your respiratory system is going to be integral in bringing in oxygen. And it's not just bringing in oxygen, but it's getting rid of, remember with glucose, it gets broken down. And that carbon, that inorganic carbon, now carbon dioxide, is also going to be exhaled. And then finally, something unrelated to cell respiration is going to be the nitrogenous wastes that we have in our body. So we're constantly taking proteins and they're getting broken down, and we have all kinds of other stuff that are constantly getting broken down. So the system that's responsible for getting rid of that stuff is going to be called the excretory system. And what that's making is urine. Yay. Interestingly enough, waste products are the gotten rid of by the excretory system. And I know it's really tempting to think of the digestive system and thinking of poo as a waste product, but that's actually just the stuff that didn't get digested. But we'll talk about that in a second. So exchanging materials with the environment is your digestive, respiratory, excretory systems. Next, they've been brought into the body, but how do they circulate? Or how do they get to, in the case of the excretory system, how do they get to, how do the waste products get to the bladder to then be excreted? Well, that's all about moving materials around, and that's the job of the circulatory system. Just as a quick FYI, you'll see me use cardiovascular system kind of interchangeably. So circulatory is just looking at the part of the body that is exchanging the materials, so really the blood and the blood vessels, whereas the cardiovascular includes that pump that's responsible for keeping that material moving, and that's going to obviously be your heart. And so now that you've got these different systems that are all either dumping material into the circulatory system or taking them out, so I've kind of redrawn this, right? We've got the digestive system, which is moving nutrients into the circulatory system, which is then delivering it to all the body systems. Same thing going on with the respiratory, where it's bringing in oxygen and getting it to all the different body cells, which are then pumping the waste products, carbon dioxide and other wastes, back out to either go to the respiratory system or go to the excretory system. So now that we kind of have all of those different systems laid out, an important thing is going to be coordinating all of that and making sure that the excretory system is getting rid of waste at a reasonable rate, and the digestive system is bringing in nutrients at a reasonable rate. And all of that coordination is done by two really important body systems. The first one is probably one that you are a lot more familiar with, which is the nervous system, but the second one is just as important, and that is the endocrine system. So we'll take a look at both of those in more detail here in a second. And it's time for another quick question for you. Let's see if you've got these down. So there are going to be 6 organ systems that you'll need to know. Take a second, write down what they are and what each one of them does. Okay. So as we just kind of mentioned, we've got 3 systems that are all about exchanging material with the environment. Those are the digestive, the respiratory, and the excretory. You've got the one system responsible for mixing that all around, making sure that everything gets to the body cells. That's going to be the circulatory, and then 2 systems that then coordinate all of those efforts. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at, ooh, that's really zoomed in, the systems that are responsible for exchanging material. We'll start off with the digestive system. And this system's all about bringing in the nutrients, getting those nutrients broken down into pieces that can move into the circulatory system pretty easily, and then taking anything that hasn't been digested and getting rid of it. So those respectively are the processes of ingestion, putting it into your mouth, breaking it down, chew, swallow, digesting, which is then the breakdown of the material, and then egestion, which is getting rid of it at the other end. The different parts that you will need to be at least mildly familiar with. I wouldn't necessarily like show you a diagram and have you be able to label it, but I certainly would expect you to be able to discuss any of these organs with relative competence there. So hopefully, you've seen these before. The mouth, that's going to be the first part that is responsible for ingestion, and it's also going to be where the first digestive processes are going on, because you've got different enzymes that are in your mouth and your saliva that begin to break down the food that you're eating. You transport that material from the mouth. Now it's going to go down the esophagus and then be stored in the stomach. This is going to further break down or digest all of the materials, which are then going to get passed into the small intestine. And throughout the small intestine, materials are crossing over from the digestive system and then into the circulatory system. So that's mainly happening in the small intestine, and then all the other waste stuff, the stuff that hasn't been digested, are then getting sloshed along into the large intestine, and finally concentrated until you're left with a nice solid mass there at the other end of the large intestine. The second organ system that is going to be important for exchanging material with the environment is going to be the respiratory system, and this is all about bringing in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. So again, for both of those, we're thinking about cellular respiration. Oxygen is going to be needed during the electron transport chain. Carbon dioxide is going to be produced from the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide during glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So once oxygen is going to move into the bloodstream and into all of the cells, cell respiration is going to happen. Carbon dioxide is then getting pushed out back into the bloodstream and eventually making their way to the lungs. So just like before, I'll go ahead and label these, and you don't need to necessarily worry about labeling them all yourself, but be able to speak about them for any of the assignments that you do for the Unit 4 assessment. I would hope at this point in your high school career, you know that this is the nose and that leads way into the nasal passage. Now, an important structural and functional piece to keep in mind is, so if you're taking a look, right, you can feel that hard piece, that Adam's apple. And what that is a cartilaginous, very firm piece of cartilage that holds this windpipe, which is the trachea, open. And so both the digestive system and the respiratory system are taking material in through the mouth and nose area and putting them into tubes. And when we take a look up here, the esophagus doesn't have that. It can completely collapse. But because of the fact that the respiratory system has air moving through it, and that's got a very low density, it is very highly likely to collapse. And so your trachea and then your bronchi are covered in this cartilage that's just acting like a support to keep that tube open. So the trachea is going to come down and branch into two what are called bronchi. Each bronchi then continues to branch out, and it really does, when you take a look at it under like a microscope or something, it looks very similar to the roots of a tree. Those bronchi are going to break apart into smaller and smaller bronchioles. And those bronchioles, their job is to deliver the oxygen to as many little air sacs as possible, which is then going to deliver the oxygen into the blood. So the bronchioles all collectively make up most of the tissue of the lungs. You've got two of them. Yeah, we got this. All right, good stuff. And then finally, this is probably the one you guys are the least familiar with of the systems that are exchanging material with the environment, is the excretory system. And this is all about filtering out blood. It's going to remove water if there's extra water in the blood, and it's also going to get rid of a lot of those metabolic wastes. And this is going to form something called urea. It's the chemical for which urine is named. And so we can take a look here, and the very first thing is, if this is the excretory system, you'll notice these huge like pipe things going on. Yeah, that's the descending aorta, the main blood vessel that is supplying the lower half of your body with blood. So this is incredibly closely tied into the circulatory system. Your kidneys are going to be exchanging blood constantly and filtering all of that out. So we've got right here these two kidney bean looking things. Not a very original name for the bean, considering they really do just like kidneys. So those are your kidneys, and they're going to be taking a bunch of blood and putting most of it back into the circulatory system, but any wastes or extra water are going to then be sent at this, little trapdoor system into a tube called the ureter. So each kidney has its own ureter, and both of the ureters drain into the bladder. Obviously, the bladder is going to be the temporary storage until you are able to relieve yourself, at which point you have now gotten rid of the nitrogenous wastes and extra water. So that is your excretory system. That's its job right there. So again, 3 systems that are responsible with either getting material from the environment or taking waste material and kicking it back out. Being able to, we already talked about this kind of at the beginning. Respiratory, all about taking in oxygen, getting rid of CO2. Digestive, bringing in sugar. Excretory, getting rid of wastes, right? Now we can move on to the circulatory system. As I said, this is what is going to connect the tissues of the circulatory system, of the respiratory system, digestive system, and excretory system, and connect those with every other system in the body. Every other tissue, every other cell in the body has some kind of connection to the circulatory system. And so we obviously have the heart, which is pumping the blood and going out into all of the different arteries in your body. You then have, there we go, this like branching into smaller and smaller tube system to be able to get the materials to finally be able to cross. So I almost think of it like this. If the circulatory system is your road system, which is taking everything from one part of the country, delivering it to the other parts, making sure that every single home has a way to get food and get rid of wastes, right? If this is your road system, then your arteries and veins are very much like the highways. They're going to take a huge volume of blood and be transporting it. But you don't necessarily get your food or your nutrients or anything from the highway. That material has to go from the highway to smaller and smaller and smaller roads. And those smallest of roads, those smallest little tubes that can exchange material with the tissues surrounding them, those are going to be called your capillaries. So the capillaries are really important. Hello, where's my button? There we go. Capillaries are really important for being where the material actually gets exchanged. So oxygen's coming in, getting used up. The glucose is coming in, getting used up. Carbon dioxide is made as our other wastes. And so we can kind of see that there's this constant one-way flow. So we're going to have blood always moving from arteries, which are carrying oxygen away from the heart, into the different tissues, into the different local roads, capillary beds, and then heading back to become reoxygenated in the veins. Okay, and then finally, our last 2 organ systems are now about detecting when things are out of whack, detecting if there is an area of the body that doesn't have adequate nutrients, or an area of the body that is maybe too hot or too cold, or just something isn't quite right. you don't just need to be constantly bringing in as much material as you can. You need to have it regulated so that the body can maintain homeostasis. And the two systems that are going to be responsible for that, as we said, are the nervous and the endocrine system. The nervous, that's your nerves, that's your brain, your spinal cord, and all of the little nerves that innervate all of your tissues. And that's really quick. A nerve signal can go from fingertip, send it up to your brain, and make a response incredibly rapidly. I mean, fractions of a second. Think about putting your hand on a hot stove. The response can be really rapid, but it's not necessarily a long-lived response. Once you jerk your hand away, the signal's done, the action's over, and the end of the story. So the nervous system's very, very quick. The endocrine system is going to be a much slower, long-lasting type of response. So this works by taking different glands that are in your body. So here's a whole bunch of different pictures of them, and you don't need to memorize what these are, luckily for you. But things like the hypothalamus, the pineal glands, the adrenal glands you've probably heard of, they make adrenaline. The ovaries, the testes, the parathyroid glands. Again, maybe you haven't heard of these, but these are some of the glands in your body. Oh, and this little guy here, the pancreas. So these are all glands. And what a gland is defined as is any structure or tissue in your body that is secreting hormones. Okay, so now we have a new definition here, and a hormone is just a chemical signal that gets sent from a gland into the blood and washes over your entire body. Those hormones get circulated through every tissue. So whereas in the nervous system, it's very like one-to-one. You're not going to be sending a signal if, let's say you touch a hot stove. That signal is going to travel up your arm to your brain. The brain isn't going to tell every part of the body, like, move. Instead, it's going to trigger just for your hand or the part that is sitting on the hot stove to back away. But the endocrine system is going to be secreting these hormones into the circulatory system. And that's going to wash your entire body, all of the different tissues in your body, with small amounts of these chemical signals. And so the way the endocrine system works is really by being able to send out this huge message to everybody to kind of coordinate in different ways. And how different tissues respond to different hormones really depends. But for example, if your blood pressure goes really, really low, you're going to want your body to be able to coordinate which parts of the body increase blood pressure versus which ones do various other tasks. So the endocrine system is that loudspeaker, but it takes a little while. I don't know, Paul Revere, right? The British are coming, the British are coming. He's got to slowly make his way through town. Everybody finds out about it, and then that signal is going to have a much longer effect than the example that I gave of putting your hand on a hot stove. So again, coordinating all of the different body systems are going to come down to the nervous and the endocrine. The nervous is really specialized for that instantaneous kind of response, whereas the endocrine is a much broader, slower response. Okay, our last topic here to get into is negative feedback. And when we talk about negative feedback, that just means some kind of feedback that negates an original stimulus. So we need to go ahead and take a look at what a stimulus is. A stimulus is any kind of deviation away from a set point, okay? So if we look at any condition in the body, temperature, pH, concentrations of different solutes, glucose concentration, etc., all conditions that we keep at homeostasis have what is called a set point. And that doesn't mean that we're capable of keeping everything at precisely that amount. Hey, Peanut. So a perk of teaching from home is that sometimes I get to have a guest speaker. So this is my guest speaker. Who are you?
Shayla.
Can you say hi?
Hi.
Can you wave at the camera right there? Nice wave. Are you getting ready for bed?
Yeah.
Is that why you're coming to tell me to get a move on? Okay, tell Daddy it'll be like 2 minutes, okay? Do you want to sit here with me?
To go now. Oh, remember the video? Can I do it?
Okay, I'm going to teach. Here we go. So a set point is kind of the ideal, but in any kind of homeostasis, we're going to have a range that if it goes above or below the set point, it's still good, right? My daughter is like mocking me right now. Okay, so if the condition starts to creep upward, once it gets to outside of those tolerances, that ideal or that range, that is going to be a stimulus. So a stimulus is just any condition that your body is able to respond to recognize that things have changed to the point that we need to do something about it. And so to negate that in negative feedback means going the opposite way. So if we've gone up, 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 up in whatever the condition is, then the negative feedback is going to be whatever is going to help bring that back down. And ultimately, your body's ability to maintain homeostasis is all about recognizing the stimulus. We'll be up in a minute. Recognizing the stimulus, responding to it in such a way that it pushes you back in the other direction. So we'll look at a negative feedback loop in a minute. Anyway, so when we're looking at negative feedback, that means we are having a cycle that is able to take whatever that deviation, that stimulus is, and send it back. And so negative feedback are going to have a few key points that are involved. You've got this set point or this range, and some kind of activity is going to cause that condition to go out of the ideal. That's going to lead to some kind of stimulus, that change in the environment that has to be recognized. Your body can't just be like, okay, whatever, it exists. No, like you have to recognize it and then make an action to send the, to send the conditions in the opposite way. So the stimulus is the condition that is changed. The sensor is the part of the body that recognizes the presence of a stimulus, and then the effector is whatever opposes that original deviation. So the easiest example of a negative feedback loop is going to be that of something called thermoregulation. Thermo meaning temperature and regulation meaning regulated. Boom. So thermoregulation is all about keeping our body temperature stable. Later in the unit, we're going to talk about oxygen regulation, glucose regulation, pH regulation, osmotic balance / water regulation. So understand the big concepts now, and you'll make your life a little bit easier in the long run. So let me get my pen. Boom. Let me actually change the color because I'm feeling like, I don't know, bright pink. Seems like a good idea. Okay. So our set point for body temperature in humans is roughly 96 or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you've been looking at a lot of science news lately, you'll have realized that that set point they believe is changing to become a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but we're going to run with 98.6 as that set point. So there's a host of different things that can cause your temperature to start dropping, but ultimately the stimulus, if the temperature drops, is a dropped temperature. So what are some things that can cause your body temperature to cool off? Some of the most obvious ones are things that are environmental or not producing enough body heat. So when your body starts to cool down, it's not the low environment and like the conditions around you that's going to trigger you to warm up. It's that your body will start to actually cool down. The body temperature drops below 98.6, and that's going to cause or that's going to be your stimulus, is that drop in body temperature that can then be recognized by a sensor called the hypothalamus. Now, I'm not going to require you to know what that sensor is, other than to know that the thing that picks up the stimulus is in the brain. And that's going to then send a signal to effectors. And effectors are anything that causes a reversal to whatever the original stimulus was. So it's going to be a little bit easier to picture it this way. If the low temp was the stimulus, then the effector is going to do something to bump up the temperature. And what kind of things do our bodies do to be able to increase temperature? Things like shivering, things like pulling our body close in to minimize how much heat loss there is. But there's another really important one that maybe you're not so familiar with. So when you get cold, what part of your body seems to get really, really cold? Is usually going to be your hands and your feet. And the reason for that is all of the blood vessels in your entire body, like anything that's near a surface, is going to shrink right up. And the benefit of that is that not only does your blood carry oxygen and nutrients and wastes and all that other stuff, but it carries heat. So by shrinking down the vessel in something called vasoconstriction, you minimize how much heat is getting sent to the parts of your body that are less essential. It's a little sad to think, but your body's willing to sacrifice certain parts to make sure that the most essential ones are kept warm and kept alive. So if you are hiking in the Andes, what are you most likely to lose? Couple fingers, couple toes, maybe your nose. Those areas are not vital. They're not critical to your survival. So by vasoconstricting, you're limiting how much heat is going to the fingertips to the toes, and instead you're keeping that heat trapped into the core. So the brain is recognizing this low temp, maybe doing a little bit of shivering, maybe doing some vasoconstriction or some really, really strong vasoconstriction. And the effectors are the parts of the body that are then doing that. So that is going to be the muscles that are right under your skin. I'm just going to keep this a little bit more simple. Skin and blood vessels. Okay. I'm not going to say easy enough because it's really kind of counterintuitive, or at least something that you have to think through. So the cause that leads to a drop in body temperature is going to be some kind of low environmental temperature, exposure to something cold. The body temperature is going to drop. The brain recognizes that, sends the signal, hey, we got to warm everything up. Hey, skin, hey, blood, do your thing, and starts producing more heat. In addition, there's a lot of behavioral responses, but I won't get too far into those. Okay, on the flip side, there's plenty of things that can cause your body to rise above a set point. Don't get ahead of me here, because I know where you're going. We're going to talk about fevers in a second. But when your body is set at 98.6 degrees and it gets hotter, then we're going to have the second half of the feedback loop commence. And one of the biggest things that is going to cause all that extra heat, laws of thermodynamics. Remember, your matter constantly recycled, energy is constantly transferred, and each time you transfer energy, a little is lost as heat. So if you're in the middle of any kind of strenuous exercise and you're taking glucose and you're breaking it down to carbon dioxide, and energy is getting transferred from chemical energy in one place to NADPH to ATP, getting broken down, getting used, all those little transfers are leading to a huge production of heat. So exercise is one of the biggest causes of your set point to go up above 98.6 degrees. This doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Your body's able to manage it, but exercise is going to be one of the big ones there. So other things that can cause an increase to your body's temperature is just too much clothing, not being able to sweat enough, but we're going to focus on the most physiologically normal one. And so the stimulus is increased body temperature. And just like before, we're going to be looking at the brain that is going to recognize that. So what do you do when your body is hot? There's some really obvious ones. Think about Okay, you've just gone running. Depends on how far that is. For me, let's say I run 200 feet. I'm kidding, really, I can do more than that. You're going to notice that if you look at me, my face is bright red. And I'm guessing for a lot of you, the same thing is going to hold true. So just like vasoconstriction is going to limit how much heat loss there is into the environment, if those blood vessels open way up, that's going to increase how much blood is right under the surface of the skin. If you've got a ton of blood that's pumping right through under the surface, then there's the potential for a lot of heat loss. How do you increase heat loss? Unit 2, water, sweating. So we're going to have a process of vasodilation, bringing more heat to the surface, and sweating that's going to allow for that evaporative cooling to occur to drop the body temperature back down. And in this case, same effectors as what we saw on the other side. So if you've got questions, let me know. I hope I made sense of this unit and didn't babble for too long. And I will catch you on the flip side. Have a good night and take care of yourself. Oh, fever. I didn't tell you about fever. So listen, fever, let's come back up here. Fever is not your body going out of homeostasis. Instead, what's happening is your set point, instead of being at 98.6 degrees, your body's like, nah, fam, we got to change this up a little bit, because if we stay at 98.6 degrees, whatever is infecting us, whatever virus or bacteria is all up inside of us, is going to thrive. So it's not that you are going out of homeostasis. Instead, it's the set point increasing. So things like, let's say 102 degrees Fahrenheit, that's going to be enough to denature some of the proteins that are going to be found in the in viruses or in bacteria or even in some parasites, and that slows down how quickly they can reproduce. So keep that fever up, and all of a sudden you're able to fight off the infection more rapidly. That's also why, even though you might have a fever of, let's say, 100, 101, you tend to get chills really bad, and that's because your body is recognizing the stimulus of a temperature that is below whatever that set point is. So yeah, you've got a fever and you're hot, but your body is sending the same signals as if you're cold. So, you start to shiver, and that causes your body temperature to rise back up to whatever the body's set point is. So, okay, now with all of that in mind, I'll catch you on the flip side, and have a good day, night, whenever it is you're watching this. There you go.